Pan-Africanists are really in love with the message of this guy. They love the message that he said that the reason why imperialism continues on the African continent is because the Africans continue to sell out to the West. And so many people now want to understand, who is this guy? What does he do? And where does he come from? This is Brian Kagoro. He's a lawyer from Zimbabwe, and he's one of the biggest sellouts on the African continent because he continues to be paid by George Soros and other Western NGOs to maintain imperialism on the African continent. This man was among the men and lawyers in Zimbabwe that tried to stop Zimbabwe from having a formal and legal land reform process by trying to stop the change of the Zimbabwean constitution to allow the Zimbabwean government to take land and to force the British government to compensate its white farmers for the land that the Zimbabwean government was going to take back from colonizers. He's also one of the people that were involved in approaching the West from the opposition that called for sanctions on the Zimbabwean people to force the Zimbabwean people to vote for that opposition, to bring them into power so that they can reverse land reform. That is who Brian Kagoro is. I call Brian Kagoro the Moyetse Chombe of Zimbabwe. And here's the story. So in 1997, Robert Mugabe announced to the British government that for the past 17 years, we've been trying to force you to pay the money for us to take land from your settlers to compensate the Zimbabwean people for the land that they lost during colonialism and that they went to fight in the liberation struggle for. And so he told the British government that we are going to take land. The Open Society Foundation of Southern Africa that belongs to George Soros then approached these young lawyers from the University of Zimbabwe and asked them to create a civil society organization that is called the Broad-Based Civil Alliance. And they told the Broad-Based Civil Alliance to go throughout Zimbabwe with huge amounts of money to discourage the Zimbabwean people to vote for a change to the constitution of Zimbabwe, because that change to the constitution of Zimbabwe would have allowed the Zimbabwean government, through the constitution, to take land and to force the British government to compensate its settler farmers and also to make sure that it paid all damages for whatever was lost when that land was taken. So when these guys went out into Zimbabwe to convince the Zimbabwean people not to vote for a constitutional change, they were asking Zimbabweans not to vote to take back their own land and not to vote for the British government to pay for the compensation of its own children. So today you see the Zimbabwean government compensating white farmers with $3.5 billion US. It is because people like him convinced the Zimbabwean people not to vote for a constitutional change that would have forced the British government to compensate its own settlers for illegally taking Zimbabwean land. They convinced the Zimbabwean people not to vote for a constitutional change by saying that a constitutional change would allow Mugabe to become a lifetime president. But they never said anything about the issue of land. So when the Zimbabwean government outclassed them by changing a law that was called the Land Acquisition Act, they then went on to go to the Western powers and say, let us create an opposition movement that can remove ZANU-PF so that we can reverse the plan for land reform. So when they formed their party 2 months prior, the American government began sanctions with its European partners on Zimbabwe by denying the Zimbabwean government loans from the IMF and the International Development Association that had already approved loans to develop infrastructure, electricity, and the rail system in Zimbabwe. This was meant to frustrate the Zimbabwean people, to destroy jobs, so that the Zimbabwean people would vote for the opposition that these guys, the Broad-Based Civil Alliance, had formed in 1999 November that was going to contest elections in 2000 May. In 2000 May, they then went and contested elections after winning the referendum where the Zimbabwean people said no to changing the constitution, but they lost by 4 seats. After losing by 4 seats in this political contestation, instead of accepting the results, Brian Kagoro, Tendai Biti, and other lawyers of the opposition movement went to the United States and said, we're having another set of elections in 2002 for the president. So if you want Mugabe to lose those presidential elections, impose more sanctions It is said that Brian Kagoro, Tendai Biti, David Coulthard, and other lawyers from the opposition of Zimbabwe then wrote a document to the Congress of the United States that then became the act known as IDERA, that became the sanctions that persecuted the Zimbabwean people, deprived them of water, healthcare, education, and loans from Western multilateral lending institutions to develop Zimbabwe. Hence, you see the displacement of refugees throughout Southern Africa in this persecution and crime against humanity caused by people like Brian Kagoro. Brian Kagoro has been one of the people that have maintained imperialism in Zimbabwe as he takes checks from people like the Soros Foundation, the Westminster Democracy Fund that's controlled by the British government. The British government, white farmers from South Africa, and white farmers from Zimbabwe. He is a lawyer who perpetuates a crime against humanity of imposing illegal sanctions, depriving people water, healthcare, education, food, development, and medicines in Zimbabwe. When we created a new law called the Patriotic Act to punish Zimbabweans who call for sanctions, just last year, this man, while making this video, was actually opposing a law that criminalizes Zimbabweans who call for sanctions. Today, I, a non-lawyer, had to create this organization to actually bring the United Nations to Zimbabwe, to declare sanctions on Zimbabwe illegal. I am the one that has been taking sanctions implementers to court because it is a crime against humanity, while lawyers like this guy have been opposing us, fighting us, and have never denounced the illegal sanctions on Zimbabwe because they are serving imperialism. He is no different to Kagame and to a certain extent Julius Malema, who continues to denigrate and denounce the Zimbabwean government for decolonizing. Kagame continues to kill people in Congo for the Western countries to continue to loot with ease. Now, the question you're going to ask is, how are all these people associated? They are associated because they belong to a fraternity of Freemasons. And that is why you saw even Julius Malema, when he commemorated Robert Mugabe, he put around Robert Mugabe's neck a Freemason chain with a sign of Freemasons, because these guys are all Freemasons. And now that Pan-Africanism is becoming popular, they're being paid to mislead African youth and to continue imperialism by making it look like they're Pan-Africanists. You might not believe me now, but in future you will see that what I'm saying is true, and you will see that these sellouts are now pretending to be Pan-Africanists in not a different manner to what you saw Mobutu Sese Seko doing, and what it is that Kagame is doing today. Be careful of who you think is a Pan-Africanist and your hero.